in 2011 at Camp Bastion in Afghanistan, I watched a company of Royal Marines commandos heading deep into hostile territory. Their mission was to set up a new patrol base as a lure to attract the enemy to them. They're going in effectively as human bait, and they're going to invite attack.
At 1-2 Delta, get your Bergens on the flatbed and load onto that first coat. Do that.
This is a very, very risky mission indeed. The place is reportedly crawling with insurgents.
What's fellas? Stop getting in your order march.
Now 100 Royal Marines are heading out tonight. And of course everybody's praying that 100 Royal Marines will eventually return. I had my fears, but as I watched those men depart, I could never have imagined the fate that awaited them. Of these Marines, 3 were to die, 20 were to be seriously injured, and 1, eventually to be known to everybody as Marine A, was to commit a battlefield crime so serious that it was to send shockwaves around the world.
A Royal Marine is found guilty of murdering an Afghan insurgent in cold blood. Evidence from a helmet camera showed how the injured Afghan was shot in the chest. Senior commanders condemn what happened.
It was a truly shocking and appalling aberration. It should not have happened, and it should never happen again.
In my letters I write to him, I always put, I'm very proud of you, son. You haven't disgraced yourself. You haven't disgraced us.
He's murdered somebody, and murder is murder. Murder is murder. It never really applies because all murders are different.
Who's to say in the kind of ebb and flow of a firefight, when all these things are going on around you, who among us might not do the same thing?
Marine A is the first British serviceman to be convicted of murder on active service since the Second World War. But was the killing a tactical decision? Was it a mercy killing? Or was it a battlefield execution prompted by revenge and hatred? The act of a man traumatized by war.
Deliver ray of fire now, lad.
When I first heard that it was a Royal Marine who had been arrested for the cold-blooded murder of a badly injured Taliban insurgent, I have to admit I was shocked to the core. As a filmmaker, I've been privileged to train with the Royal Marines, live with them, and go to war with them on many occasions in Afghanistan.
Get down into cover. Move around. Quickly get down low. Just get down to that low.
We're under heavy attack. Taliban are fighting back hard. Now these men normally espouse a strong ethos of ferocity in battle, but magnanimity in victory. And alongside them I've experienced the mind-bending terror and thrill of combat. I've known Marines who've been killed in action, and I've known many who've suffered horrific, life-changing injuries. So, cards on the table. I don't come to this story as a dispassionate observer. I come as a passionate one. It's not just that I want to know what happened on that fateful day. I need to know. Marine A was eventually revealed as a 5-tour veteran who'd seen action in Northern Ireland, Iraq and Afghanistan. By all accounts, a fine soldier with an unblemished record, and who'd been marked for promotion. He was 39-year-old Sergeant Alexander Blackman. So what sort of man is he?
He's amazing. Never met anybody like him. He's just so gentle and calm and generous, and yes, he's a big softie.
Is your husband a murderer?
Absolutely not. No way, no shape, no form. Just categorically no.
Even though he's convicted as one?
I don't know that I know what defines somebody as a murderer, but everything that defines Al points me and everybody else in completely the opposite direction.
I'll love him no matter what, and I know he's had to make difficult different choices and things that I wouldn't want to have to make personally, but it's war. It's not the black and white wars that we want them to be. It's every shade of grey in between.
I'm not ashamed of him because he was doing his job, he was doing his duty to the country and everybody in this country and the Queen. And that's what he was sent out to do, to get rid of the insurgents.
The trouble is that we're trying very hard to rationalise something that happened in a war zone, in a different country, on the other side of the world, in circumstances that none of us will ever begin to understand.
It's true. Nobody could imagine real war. You have to be there. Well, back in 2011, I was, and I discovered that by complete coincidence, it was Sergeant Blackman's company I had filmed heading out from Camp Bastion to enemy territory. Less than 2 weeks later, after they'd come under sustained and heavy attack and taken many casualties, they were relieved temporarily by another company of Royal Marines, a company that I was embedded in. So I flew into exactly the same place that Sergeant Blackman had been serving in, and was to serve in again, and where a few months on, he was to shoot that insurgent. This beleaguered British outpost, called Toki, was nothing short of a death trap set in the middle of what was described to me then as the most dangerous square mile in the world.
The main threat will be IEDs. Actions on contact IED. Get an IED, okay, with goal firm, self-treat yourself if you've got any arms and legs left. Okay, I'll call in the helo, so it should be at Bastion, I don't know, within 21 minutes or whatever, okay?
My time at this place was to give me an intimate insight into a brutally unforgiving way of life.
They think that they'll only have a go at us if they think that we are vulnerable or they'll get away with it. And that's what it's all about, engaging them on our terms when they think they're okay. The key thing is to try and kill them. If we get the chance, that's the priority.
The men's job was to seek out the Taliban who'd been intimidating the local villagers and farmers for years. The Marines were there primarily to protect the local Afghan people. Everybody keeping a sharp lookout for anybody watching us, basically, and there's bound to be. We can't see them at the moment, but they'll be monitoring our movements all the way. If we repeat our routes, it's easy to catch us out and lay those killer traps. So every footstep is taken very gingerly, believe me. And all this in scorching heat. It's about 50 degrees today. It feels more like 100 degrees. By the time I got to Toki, 4 men had been killed and many more injured, all through booby traps and mines.
The best word to describe them is fucking cowards. They realise they can't stand and fight us, they're just resorting to dirty tactics, you know, and prove how cowardice they are. I mean, they get children to do their dirty work for them, you know, send them out to watch us and then reporting to us, and women, you know, if they want to flip and take us on, take us on. Don't be fucking pussies about it. You know, I fucking hate them, all of them.
Well, was Sergeant Blackman a Marine who couldn't contain that sort of emotion? Whilst he could still be ferocious in battle, had he lost that famous Royal Marine ability to be magnanimous in victory? Had he simply lost the plot? The incident was captured on a fellow Marine's head camera. For legal reasons I can't show you the moving footage, but I can play you still frames and let you hear some of the audio. It all started with an Apache helicopter attack that left a Taliban insurgent severely injured. What followed in these cornfields spanned at least 40 minutes.
You fucking bastard. You brown fella. You're fuck about you, son.
Sergeant Blackman and his men dragged the insurgent across the field and discussed what to do with him.
Anybody want to do first aid on this idiot? Nope. Nope.
They'd already found and removed a live grenade and a weapon hidden in the insurgents' clothes. Next comes an indication that despite initial reluctance, they at least go through the motions of patching the insurgent up.
We'll patch him an FFD. That'll do, Mona.
And then some sporadic talk about calling in a helicopter to evacuate the insurgent as a battlefield casualty.
Better send up a 999 first. Yeah, we're just waiting to get out of our line and may go with it.
And there, a radio message to suggest that the insurgent was dead. Then, a few minutes later, a gunshot. Sergeant Blackman discharging his weapon into the insurgent's chest. If he was not dead, he is now.
Yeah, shuffle off his mortal coil, you cunt. Nothing you would do to us. I know. Exactly. Alright. Obviously this doesn't go anywhere, fellas. Yeah, roger, mate. I've just broken the Geneva Convention. Yeah, roger.
He'd done, but as far as his court-martial was concerned, this was not the desecration of a corpse, but a cold-blooded battlefield execution, recorded on one of these, although Sergeant Blackman didn't know it at the time. So, Blackman, caught red-handed, guilty as charged, banged to rights. But his conviction of murder, a life sentence of 10 years without parole, and dismissed with disgrace from the Royal Marines, has, at a stroke, provoked strong public reaction and divided opinion. This is the day of sentencing for the killers of Lee Rigby, the British soldier brutally murdered by Muslim extremists on a South London street. The killing horrified the nation, and many here now are ex-servicemen who've come to express their outrage.
You can see that all around me now. There's a lot of passion. A lot of people around here have got very distinct views, very real views, very strong views about the justice that is involved in this. And of course they've got equally strong opinions about Marine A and his conviction.
He was in a theatre of war and it shouldn't even have gone as far as court. Simple as that.
The whole justice system in this country has literally been flipped upside down. We're sending our soldiers to jail for life for doing their job, but we're allowing paedophiles and murderers to roam the streets. I think it's an absolute disgrace.
Our soldiers have seen the mates being strung up and hung up in trees, chopped to bits. That's got to have an effect on somebody, and that, it doesn't deserve a sentence.
How can it possibly be murder? You're sent to war zone to kill. He's a Marine, his job is to kill. And his job was to kill terrorists.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the 10th of April in this very building there's going to be an appeal by Marine A, Sergeant Blackman. So if everyone's willing, we're going to be back here on the April 10th to show our solidarity for a true British hero who's risked his life for this country. All right?
Perhaps not surprisingly, here there is nigh on universal support for Sergeant Blackman. But this is just one poll of opinion. And let's not forget, the background to his conviction is, as he admitted, the breaking of the Geneva Convention.
It is only for the protection of prisoners, the sick and wounded, and the non-combatant civilians that Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions applies. International law prohibits the following: murder, torture, cruel treatment of prisoners or taking hostages, humiliating or degrading treatment of prisoners, illegal sentencing and execution of prisoners without a fair trial by a regularly constituted court.
The Geneva Convention has actually been around since 1864, and most recently revised in 1949.
There was a massive revulsion post-Second World War to what had happened. That's why you need rules, because if the human being is left to their own devices, they do bad things.
So your view of Alexander Blackman?
My view is he's let himself down, he's let his family down, he's let his regiment down, he's let his country down. He's murdered somebody. And murder is murder, whether it's on the streets of London or in Afghanistan. And people who confuse the debate with fog of war type arguments, you know, he's on active duty, he somehow deserves some extra element of discretion. That's nonsense. It was a murder. He was found guilty of murder. He deserves the sentence he received, in my view.
Clearly everyone has an opinion about Marine A, Sergeant Blackman. Some condemning him, some condoning him. But the ethical and moral issues his case throws up are profound.
Marine A should be serving a prison sentence. He committed an atrocity, he knew it was an atrocity, he laughed about the Geneva Conventions. So yes, it is completely appropriate that he's punished for that. You know, war is not a free-for-all. We train our soldiers to not only to kill people but also to not kill people, to know where that line is, and we can't simply have people breaking the laws of war. We have seen in previous conflicts, the Vietnam War being the most obvious one, where there was huge complicity with the committing of atrocities, and once you start doing that, it very, very rapidly escalates and becomes an even more serious issue. So yes, it is completely right that he was convicted and that he is being punished for it.
It's not a straightforward situation. There are two different moral imperatives. One is that you shouldn't kill, and the other is that if you put people in extreme situations and ask them to act on your behalf, you can't be as judgmental as you would be about a case of an ordinary murder in the street. The thing that keeps soldiers fighting isn't love of democracy or Queen and country or the things that people say. It's loyalty to the little troop of people around them that they've trained with. And they will put their lives on the line for the other people in that group in the way that they know that the others will do for them. And that sense of loyalty, that sense of solidarity, it's summed up in the phrase a sacred band of brothers. And the word sacred is not incidental there. It goes to something really deep in the human psyche. So that kind of loyalty will make you rush out and draw fire so that your colleagues can escape to safety, but it will also make you feel you need revenge for the wrongs that have been done to your colleagues.
Dave Devenny was a Royal Marines commander who fought in the Falklands War. On leaving the forces, he was ordained in the Church of Scotland. He then returned to the Royal Marines as the chaplain. He has special insight into battlefield behaviour.
It's very difficult for many, many young men and women who are in conflict in Afghanistan to try and get inside the minds of the people who are actually trying to kill them. So they're kind of one step emotionally removed from the people they're called to go out and engage. They can't relate to them. They find it very difficult. They see them often as completely barbaric, and sometimes, you know, when things happen in the battlefield, they are. I mean, you know, there's been instances of, you know, soldiers who have been captured, have been killed, skinned alive, dismembered, and their body parts left out to warn off the other members of patrols. So that's quite a tough situation to find yourself in, and I can understand sometimes when you get young men and women in that situation that there's almost a sense of a temptation at least to feel that, hang on a second, you know, all the bets are off here. You know, we're playing to a certain set of rules and criteria, but these guys aren't. You know, and they would kill us like dogs as soon as they catch us. You know.
I was always told in Afghanistan, never let yourself be captured by the Taliban. Sooner put a bullet in your own head than let that happen. I never had to face that choice, thank God. But I'll never forget the emotional pressure of going out on patrol. Never knowing if the enemy would be hiding in the cornfields waiting to attack, or if your next footstep was going to detonate a mine, an IED. Rob Driscoll, an ex-Royal Marine sergeant, was mentioned in dispatches for conspicuous gallantry in Afghanistan. He served alongside Sergeant Blackman in the hellhole that was Toki.
I think we knew that where we were going, we were the bait and we were going into the lion's den, and we kind of were lured into killing areas, and it really was just a series of ambushes on each patrol that left a safe base.
Go! Yeah, safe!
Unfortunately, we were outgunned on several occasions, so yeah, it was pretty hairy because we had to wait to be shot at.
Ah, that's right. You couldn't shoot until you were shot at.
No. If we'd have to positively ID a threat, and then that threat would then have to become a threat to us. So in theory, we could positively ID a Taliban fighter with a weapon, but until he's pointed that weapon at us, under those rules of engagement, we weren't able to return fire or protect ourselves.
I recall this myself. Everyone was always on full alert when on patrol, knowing that ambush was likely. It was chilling, and doubly chilling when you had to wait for the enemy to make the first move. But those were the rules, and they were set in stone.
British troops in Afghanistan are not allowed to fight until the Taliban attack them, and that puts them under psychological pressure. It's almost like fighting with one arm tied behind your back. If the soldier feels that he's not being treated fairly by the rules of engagement, that the dice is loaded against him, that can build up a sort of resentment and a feeling that this very dangerous task is being made more difficult than it should be. And you can see that that will lead to frustration, feeling of impotence, and a lowering of morale.
How are you coping with the pressure?
I'm not sure if coping was the right kind of answer. I think as a commander, people were looking up to me, and I had to almost project an unnerved appearance. But I was as worried as the young Marines were. In fact, probably more so, because I'd experienced what the Taliban were capable of in previous tours. So I think the way we coped was a black humour, which is typical of the Royal Marines, and from an outsider's perspective, it could almost look as if there's an element of enjoyment, and that is a survival kind of technique that you adopt in those situations.
Hostile, threatening environments can lead to a view of the world and those close to you that is beyond normal experience. Gwen Adshead is a specialist in the psychology of murder.
This has almost more in common with gang violence in a way than it does with, sort of type of regular homicide. The young men in gangs, I think often talk this way about taking out members of opposite gangs, and certainly have a pride and a satisfaction in taking out other guys, and would have no question of holding back, and the rules don't apply. Knowing that it may be wrong in the eyes of others, but from their own perspective, in terms of the code of the gang warfare, as it were, there's a type of honour to it. Of course, in theory, armies fighting other armies are not like gangs, but that I guess that many people would say is that those classical rules of war, the notion of two armies meeting and playing by the rules, has gone out the window a long time ago.
Rob, the day Sergeant Blackman shot the insurgent, do you recall the circumstances?
Well, I remember the day very well. We'd been out on patrol. We'd actually been engaged on that patrol, and we'd had to essentially withdraw from the area, and we were unable to complete our task because it would have meant going forward into an area where we knew that there were a lot of Taliban. So I was in the checkpoint when events unfolded, and I was relieved when ultimately the Taliban insurgent died. It did mean that we wouldn't have to mobilise a medical evacuation helicopter. Tactically, they would have done anything to incur more injuries on ISAF troops. If they could shoot a helicopter down, well then, we would have handed them the trophy.
The insurgent that Sergeant Blackman shot had already been shot by an Apache helicopter, so he would have been pretty badly hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I saw quite a few people that had been or sustained injuries from the Apache helicopters, and although I'm not a medical professional, I would say, again, very few of them would survive their injuries.
So, Rob, what would you have done?
In my professional view, I wouldn't have approached a injured Taliban fighter. I would have eliminated that threat from a distance. So I think, if I'm really, really honest, I probably would have done the same.
In that kind of situation, when you see friends being killed, or even when you look down on enemy deads, you always think that could be me. It's human nature. You look, I mean, I remember looking at dead Argentines on Mount Harriet and thinking, my gosh, that's someone's husband or son or whatever. And that could easily have been me tonight. So you take that away with you. And I look back on it and think, well, you know, I did exactly what I had to do as a professional young Royal Marine commando, but also I grew up, if you like, in the midst of that conflict.
But let me ask you, Dave, I know you're a chaplain, but can you say, hand on heart, that you might not have done exactly the same as Blackman?
No, I couldn't say hand on heart that I wouldn't have done the same thing. I think in that situation, and I have to say that I don't know all the details, but hypothetically, if we'd in a firefight, there was a potentially mortally wounded Afghan fighter lying there, I would have patrolled towards him, you know, and probably from a distance, a safe distance, fired some shots into him, because these guys will quite happily often just die, pull a grenade when you're or be lying on a grenade, you turn them over, you get hit, or as you approach, pull a grenade, and you've lost the guys in your section. And I think as a senior NCO tasked with the care of my team, then I would in all probability, for the safety of my guys, would have shot into his body till I was convinced the guy was no longer a threat.
I'm not a combatant, of course. I shoot with a camera, not a gun. But after spending time in Toki, always under threat of attack and the fear of capture, even I found my mind was bending, hardening to the kill or be killed environment.
We had been dehumanised so much because of the barbaric nature of the Taliban. I mean, these guys weren't there that would shoot you and then, you know, give you a noble burial. They would hang you up in a tree and crucify you and cut off your testicles, put them in your mouth. That's the nature of the people we were dealing with. You know, how do you deal with an enemy like that? You know, they saw our kind of laws and our kind of behaviour as weakness. Do we walk around being the weak security force, or do we have to project an air of Taliban masculinity? It's a huge adaptation that every single Marine or every single combat soldier that has dealt with the Taliban will have had to go through. And I think, you know, we had to almost equalise their brutality within the laws imposed on us, which is very hard.
The Taliban have no rules at all, and sometimes their behaviour is quite appalling to our mind. Indeed, there's no moral equivalence, I believe, between one of our soldiers, a Marine or soldier, who's joined up to protect his nation, has gone through proper training, has been taught how to behave and things, and a terrorist who actually their stated aim actually is to kill innocent civilians because they want to draw attention to their cause. So there's no moral equivalence there.
The kind of pressures that are on these men when they're in that situation are very, very hard to imagine for those who haven't been in that kind of situation. And when they get to grips with the enemy, when they come face to face with the enemy, an enemy, let's not forget, that has absolutely no scruples, that does not play fair, does not play by the rules, that is quite happy to cut people up, torture them, hang their limbs up from trees, that then when our soldiers are faced with these people who have killed their own men, then yes, you can hope that they will not behave in the kind of way that Sergeant Blackman did. You can train them not to, but you can't guarantee they won't. It's the nature of conflict, it's the nature of war.
In the early days of the Afghan conflict, when it was, relatively speaking, a conventional shooting war, there was, I would say, a begrudging respect for the Taliban as fierce but courageous warriors. But in later years, when the Taliban started resorting to brutal guerrilla tactics, they were increasingly demonized.
Most of the young men and women who are out there on the battlefield in Afghanistan do not understand that culture. And in some respects see these guys who are these insurgents, these Taliban fighters as something less than human, especially when they see their friends, their mates, their oppos being brutally killed and barbarously dealt with, even after death.
No matter what the British Army or the British government or the British population thinks of the Taliban and the various factions fighting within the Taliban do not see themselves as murdering terrorists. That's not how they see themselves. How they see themselves, they have all kinds of rationales for what they're doing. But the overall justification for the kind of methods they use is they are the weaker side. They are the weaker side, therefore they're obliged to use whatever methods can get them results.
The thing is, once one side starts breaking the rules, there's always a danger that the other side will too. This has happened throughout the history of warfare, and is always accelerated if there's an obvious cultural disconnect between foes.
The Afghan people are perceived as being extremely so different from your sort of British soldier, and the culture is so different that it makes it very easy to sort of assume, well, maybe they don't really feel as much, maybe they all are actually terrorists, you know, their lives aren't worth as much as the British lives. So you treat the enemy as though they are lesser human, or maybe not even human at all, they're just animals to be hunted, they're fair game. It's an attempt to ignore the fact that, of course, the person that you are killing, the person you are mutilating, is flesh and blood like you, has a wife, has children the same age as your children, has an aged grandmother or whatever. So dehumanizing them tries to alleviate that guilt.
Yes, Japanese is very funny people. You might not call them human beings, they're more like animals. The better estimation of them is more like field rats.
Dehumanization is so much easier to do if the enemy is of a different culture, different religion, different ethnicity. And we saw this, of course, during the Second World War very strongly, that the Second World War, British and American soldiers were much more atrocity prone in the war in the Pacific than they were in Europe, for example.
That war was a war where the Japanese culture was so alien to these young guys coming out of America. They couldn't see them as humans, really, basically human beings, and especially because there was many instances where the Japanese themselves were quite barbaric towards the US Marine Corps and the soldiers on the ground. And so it seems that war became, everything was ranked up a ratchet or two, and it wasn't a case of just bringing these guys to the negotiating table. They were just quite content to annihilate them.
There are lots of examples of prisoners of war being killed after they've surrendered in both world wars. Ian Fraser, an officer in the Scots Guards, wrote home to his mother in May 1945 to say to her, "Don't imagine that when German troops who've been trying to kill us put their hands up and say, 'We surrender,' that we accept their apology. And we make a point of dispatching them quickly, because these are the conventions of war. They would do exactly the same to us. And it's unfair of civilians to expect us to behave in a different way." He says to his mother, "You probably won't understand this, but my father, I think, will, because he fought at Gallipoli and he has direct experience of combat with the Turks, and he will understand that the rules of war are so different to what we as civilized civilians are willing to accept."
The reality is, once you get involved in heavy fighting, things change.
A city is literally being wiped out before your eyes. Explosions and fires are sucking the oxygen from the air. Nothing can live in this inferno.
Who would have thought in 1939 that we would firebomb major cities with the aim of immolating children, women, all of these things? It would have been inconceivable. But as you fight, things change. That's what's so horrible about war. That's why it's much better if you don't end up in wars. And yes, you need rules, and there are rules, and it's quite clear if you've broken them. And there's no doubt that this Marine did break the rules. But I think you have to take all those other factors into account.
Yeah, shuffle off this mortal coil, you can. Nothing you would do to us.
I know.
Exactly.
It all came across as very callous. I mean, a lot of people have been shocked by the foul-mouthed language, the Shakespearean quote and the laughing. I mean, it did come over as pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I agree what he said. It did sound very dramatic, and I think there is an air of drama that comes with command. And I think what we witnessed there was a bit of bravado. That man had adrenaline coursing flowing through his veins, you know. He knows that after that threat, he's still got a 600 or 700 metre walk back to his CP, which when me and you sit here and talk about walking 600 or 700 metres, it seems nothing. 600 or 700 metres in Afghanistan is 600 or 700 potential IED steps. This was all running through his mind.
I think you can deconstruct Blackman's words quite carefully. You've got this Shakespearean quote, you've got the expletive, and then you've got this notion, this isn't anything that you wouldn't do to us. So in that, there's a kind of high emotion, the poetry, quoting Shakespeare, shuffle off this mortal coil, and then this very base word which changes the tone of it entirely. And then a kind of moral justification, I'm not doing anything you wouldn't do, so therefore it's all right. So within that little few words, you see some of this confusion and these moral clashes and these cultural clashes, the emotion versus the reason, the self-justification, and the vehemence in the expletive. In those few little words, you see the entire confusion of the situation captured.
But was it a moral confusion spurred by hate and a hunger for revenge, or a mental confusion brought on by exhaustion and emotional distress?
You can't train anyone to be relentlessly attacked. And if we were to put it into kind of a civilian context, you know, relentlessly punched in the face and do nothing, which we did do for a long time. So I think, did that one punch on the nose flick something that reacted another punch back? It's as simple as that. Did he flick into a primeval sense? I'm not a psychologist, I can only talk from my experiences, but I know there were moments out there where I did see the red mist. I lost the plot. You know, I know that there were moments out there where I was not fully sane.
It's been described as a moment of madness, and I think that describes it perfectly. He can't undo it. I'm sure he'd love to meet Doctor Who, travel back in time and undo that moment. I don't doubt it for a second. I'm still not sure that we quite should have led us to where we are now. But yeah, if we could, absolutely. In a millisecond.
If you had to put a label on it, why not call it a moment of madness? Because I think that's probably that's the most digestible phrase. I think if you look into depth what a moment of madness is, then maybe you can see what was happening with Al. We're only human, and we actually only undergo a year's worth of training. It's an incredibly efficient year's worth of training, but they haven't removed our brain and inserted a computer which completely obeys orders. We're as professional as we can be. I think my point is, how do you train for that moment? How do you install this moral compass? And as much as that moral compass wants to do the right thing, sometimes you're overcome by other emotions and there are other bigger considerations.
When I heard the footage, I wasn't actually shocked. You know, these things are happening all the time. In any war, they're happening, other people are doing it. The difference here is that Marine A got caught. He got caught on camera. It's right that he's punished for that, but I don't think we should fool ourselves that this is an isolated case. It's happening all the time.
The National. Here is Brian Stewart.
Good evening. A Canadian soldier is facing a charge of second-degree murder tonight. Captain Robert Semrau is accused of killing a presumed insurgent in Afghanistan, a man allegedly unarmed at the time.
On October 18th, Captain Robert Semrau gave this interview to a U.S. Army journalist about an upcoming operation in Helmand Province.
We'll do some aggressive patrolling, some defensive work, and try and root out the Taliban and kill and capture them.
A short time later, he was allegedly involved in an incident there that turned him from a mentor into an accused murderer.
It's uncanny how many similarities there are between Rob Semrau's case and Alexander Blackman's. Both NATO soldiers who shoot a Taliban insurgent allegedly dead or dying after an attack by an Apache helicopter. A key difference is that Semrau, with some witnesses claiming this to have been a mercy killing, was ultimately found not guilty of murder. He was dismissed from service, however, and is now living free in Ottawa, though still imprisoned by his memories.
You couldn't pay me enough to go back to that place. No desire to ever go back. It's, you know, it's literally the dark side of the moon with mines. The enemy is very clever. They want you dead. They hate you more than they hate anything in the whole world. They will kill anybody, women and children, anyone to get to you. Everyone's expendable as long as they kill you. Nobody is the same person as he was going into that terrible place.
On the day in question, Semrau and his unit, after heavy fighting, came across a scene of utter devastation following an Apache airstrike.
If you haven't seen what an Apache gunship can do to a human being, you haven't seen anything. It's as though the hand of God comes down from the sky and just rips people apart. And we came across grievously wounded Taliban. I looked up in the trees and saw what looked like sausage links dangling from the trees, and my brain said, cannot compute, cannot compute. I didn't understand what sausage links would be doing in the trees until I realized it was human intestines. The Apache gunship had shot this Taliban, I guess, out of the tree and ripped him apart. His foot was severed, his leg was severed and up over his shoulders with just a piece of muscle connecting it. Somebody said there was like a dinner plate sized chunk ripped out of his midsection, almost like a shark bite. Some said he was alive, some said he was dead.
But then you were accused of his murder.
What I was later accused of was second-degree murder, in that the prosecution believed he was still alive, and I shot him with the intention of killing him. Witnesses attributed to me the words that I couldn't live with myself if I left a fellow human being in this condition. But how do you treat somebody like that? I've realized a few things, and it's that war many times leaves you with a choice between bad and worse. There is no good choice. There is no good option. And in many situations, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. The way the charges were set up against me, if I acted humanely and compassionately and I ended this Taliban's life, I'm a murderer, according to Canadian law, and I'm damned. If we decide to leave him, then I'm damned in that situation because I failed to perform a military duty, in that I didn't stay put and try and do something. So I'm in trouble either way. If we stayed and tried to retreat him, then in all likelihood we're going to be surrounded, much as I imagine in Blackman's case. The enemy is there. We've managed to chase him away, but he is recouping and he can come after us again. Then me and my team are surrounded and killed, and we're lucky to only be killed. So any way you look at the situation, you lose.
Semrau was acquitted of murder, but convicted of disgraceful conduct for shooting an unarmed, severely injured Taliban fighter, and dismissed from the Canadian Army. Alexander Blackman also dismissed from service, was convicted of murder and sentenced to 10 years without parole. The court-martial did not accept his story that he thought the insurgent was dead.
When he was young, little, if he was telling a fib, his ears would go red, and it would slowly go red down his neck and across his face. His brother could lie for England, but he couldn't. So I said to the officer, when Alexander said he didn't kill, he shot him, but he'd already died, did his ears go red? And he said no. So I said, in that case, he was telling the truth. He said, what do you mean? I said, he can't tell a lie. His ears go red.
It's not surprising that Alexander Blackman's family are resolutely fighting his corner.
Had a letter of support sent to the Prime Minister, so I've just mentioned that.
But for the rest of us, the question of what he did and the punishment he deserves is far more complicated.
I think it's so important that we actually maintain a very firm line. But when that line is transgressed from time to time, then I think we need to have a much more nuanced, sensitive and textured approach to the individual and the circumstances they've undergone to put them into that position where someone who could, in every other respect, in every other compartment and corner of their lives, is a moral person, a family person, a disciplined, highly valued member of an elite team, and suddenly something changes. And just to say murderer in this very ambiguous age of conflict and warfare that we live in nowadays, I think we need to take a much, much more sensitive approach to these individuals because we demand so much of them.
We have to share the responsibility as a society. Politicians who make the decisions have to share the responsibility, but they don't end up in court like Blackman. A man who's sitting at a computer in America sending drone bombs into Pakistan, killing more people than Blackman did, he's not in court. Politicians aren't in court. We're not in court. Blackman is in court. It's hard not to feel that he's a scapegoat.
Assuming that it's correct that the Taliban commit atrocities, isn't that the strongest reason as to why we should not go down to that level? Isn't that a compelling argument that we are a strong democracy, we observe the rule of law, we're much more likely to win the battle for hearts and minds if we stand firm and observe the basic principles of the laws of war and human rights law?
If you can imagine, if we had a self-cam on every soldier during the Second World War or the First World War, we would have tens of thousands of cases. Tens of thousands. Now that doesn't mean it's right, but I think we have to be realistic and pragmatic about it.
Tomorrow, the 10th of April, is Alexander Blackman's appeal in the High Court, where the Lord Chief Justice will preside. But everyone seems to have a view. Some judge Alexander Blackman. Some refuse to judge him. Some revile him, some revere him. There are extremes of opinion, and many shades of opinion in between. Of course, one person I can't talk to in this tragic story is the insurgent himself. A ruthless enemy he might have been, but he was also someone's son, someone's brother, and maybe someone's father, who knows. So let me leave you with this question. Given what you now know, given what you've seen, given what you've heard, imagine yourself in Helmand. Imagine yourself faced with that injured insurgent after a bloody battle. Imagine yourself a Royal Marine sergeant. And ask yourself this question: what would I do?